The racist judge thought he could humiliate another black man in his courtroom. But when the man pulled something from his pocket, everyone in the courtroom gasped. Marcus Washington adjusted his blue pinstripe suit in the rearview mirror of his black Audi. The morning sun hit the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the concrete. His hands gripped the steering wheel. 7 years as a federal prosecutor, and traffic court still made his jaw clench. "Just a ticket," he muttered, grabbing his briefcase from the passenger seat. The leather felt cool against his palm. He checked his watch. 8:45 a.m. 15 minutes early. The parking lot was half full. A few people hurried up the courthouse steps, clutching papers and looking nervous. Marcus took his time. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked. 2 weeks ago, he'd been driving home late from the office. Empty streets, yellow traffic light, and a cop car appearing out of nowhere. The officer had claimed Marcus ran the red. Marcus knew it was yellow, but he'd stayed calm, handed over his license, and taken the ticket without argument. Sometimes that was easier. The courthouse doors opened with a heavy push. Cold air hit his face. The security line moved slowly. An elderly white woman in front of him fumbled with her purse, apologizing repeatedly to the guard. "You can leave your keys in the basket," the guard said, his voice tired. Marcus stood quietly, watching the scene play out. When his turn came, he placed his briefcase on the conveyor belt and walked through the metal detector. No beep. The guard barely looked at him as he waved him through. The hallway stretched ahead, all wooden panels and fluorescent lights. Different from the federal courthouse where he usually worked. There, the ceilings were higher, the lights brighter, the atmosphere more formal. Here, everything felt cramped and worn. Marcus checked the docket posted on the wall. Courtroom 3B. Judge William Harrison presiding. He'd heard things about Harrison, whispers in the legal community. Old school, they said. Set in his ways. He found a seat in the back of the courtroom. Other people filtered in, mostly minorities, mostly looking worried. Marcus watched as Judge Harrison entered. White hair, stern face, black robe swishing as he walked to the bench. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The morning cases began. Marcus observed Harrison's pattern. Quick with white defendants. Questioned every detail with minorities. Harsh fines, little patience for explanations. A young Hispanic woman tried to explain about her expired registration. Harrison cut her off. "That'll be $500, Harrison said, already looking at the next case. The woman's shoulders slumped. She clutched her purse tighter as she walked out. Marcus felt his phone vibrate. A text from his colleague at the federal courthouse. "Still on for lunch?" He typed back quickly. "If this doesn't run long, more cases, more fines, more people leaving the courtroom looking defeated." Marcus took mental notes, his prosecutor's instincts kicking in. The pattern was clear, documented in the slight shifts of Harrison's tone, the different questions he asked, the varying lengths of time he spent on each case. "Marcus Washington," the bailiff called out. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. As he walked to the front, he felt Harrison's eyes on him. The judge's expression changed, subtle, but Marcus had seen that look before. That slight narrowing of the eyes, the small downturn of the mouth. "Approach the bench," Harrison said, his voice carrying that familiar edge Marcus had heard all morning, but sharper now, more pronounced. Marcus walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet courtroom. His case file felt heavy in his hands. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant background hum that seemed louder now. "You're here for running a red light." Harrison's tone made it sound like a more serious offense. "Yes, Your Honor, although I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The light was yellow when I entered the intersection." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Are you saying the officer was mistaken?" "I'm saying, Your Honor, that I have documentation showing my position in the intersection when dash." "I have the officer's report right here," Harrison interrupted, holding up a paper he hadn't consulted for any previous case. "It states clearly that you ran a red light at 11:23 p.m. Marcus kept his voice steady. "Your Honor, if you'll look at the dashcam footage I've submitted Mr. Washington," Harrison cut in again. "Are you aware that arguing with an officer's assessment only makes your situation worse?" The courtroom remained silent. Marcus could feel everyone watching. His palms felt damp, but his voice stayed firm. "I'm not arguing, Your Honor. I'm presenting evidence for your consideration, as is my right. Harrison's face flushed slightly. Your right? Let me tell you about rights, Mr. Washington. You had the right to stop at that light. You had the right to respect the law. Instead, you're wasting this court's time with excuses. Marcus had heard that tone too many times before, at law school, at fancy restaurants, at professional conferences. The tone that said, "You don't belong here." Your Honor, I have additional documentation — save it, Harrison snapped. The fine is $750. The amount hung in the air. More than any other fine that morning. More than any standard traffic fine in the county. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The injustice wasn't new, but it still stung. Every time. Your Honor, he started again, his hand moving toward his breast pocket where his federal prosecutor's badge rested. But something made him pause. Years of similar moments flashed through his mind. Each time he'd had to prove himself. Each time he'd had to show credentials to be treated with basic respect. Harrison was already looking at the next case file. Pay the clerk on your way out. Next case. Marcus stood there for a moment longer. The badge felt heavy in his pocket. The courtroom watched, waiting to see what he would do. He had a choice to make. The same choice he'd faced countless times before. But something was different today. The air felt charged with possibility. The weight of that badge, the power of his position, the responsibility he carried, it all converged in this moment. The bailiff took a step forward, ready to guide him out. But Marcus Washington wasn't done. Not this time. His hand moved again toward his pocket. And this time, he didn't stop. The morning sun through the high windows cast stark shadows across the courtroom floor. The air conditioning hummed. And in that moment, everything was about to change. Marcus's shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he turned back to face Judge Harrison. The courtroom air felt thick, heavy with tension. Harrison glanced up from his papers, irritation crossing his face at Marcus's continued presence. Is there a problem, Mr. Washington? Harrison's voice carried that same dismissive tone, but now it had an edge of warning. Yes, Your Honor, there is. Marcus kept his voice level, professional. The same voice he used in federal court when presenting evidence. I'd like to address the disparity in your sentencing. Harrison's face reddened. Excuse me? I've been sitting here all morning, Your Honor, watching you hand out fines. $200 for Mrs. Thompson's red light violation. $150 for Mr. Baker's. Yet mine is $750 for the same offense. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. That's enough. Harrison's gavel cracked against the wood. You're in contempt. Actually, Your Honor, Marcus replied, his hand still hovering near his breast pocket. I'm not. I'm making a factual observation about court proceedings, which is my right as an officer of the court. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Officer of the court? You're a traffic violator in my courtroom. Nothing more. The words hung in the air. Marcus felt them like a physical blow, but his expression didn't change. He'd learned that skill early, keeping his face neutral when the words were meant to cut. Permission to approach the bench, Your Honor, Marcus asked, his voice carrying to the back of the courtroom. Denied. Pay your fine and leave my courtroom before I have you removed. Marcus took one step forward anyway. The bailiff tensed but didn't move. Your Honor, I've watched you process 17 cases this morning. The average fine for white defendants was $175. For minorities, it's been $425. My fine is nearly double that already inflated amount. Harrison's knuckles whitened around his gavel. I won't warn you again, Mr. Washington. Leave now, or what? Your Honor? You'll demonstrate more clearly that you're applying different standards based on race. The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers stopped. Harrison's face had moved past red to purple. Bailiff! Harrison barked. Before the bailiff approaches, Marcus continued, his voice still calm. I should mention that I've been recording these proceedings. He gestured to his phone on the defense table. It's my right to do so in a public courtroom. Those recordings show a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Harrison's expression flickered. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. You have no right, Harrison began. I have every right, Marcus cut in, his voice firm but not loud. And I have an obligation to report judicial misconduct when I observe it. A woman in the back of the courtroom started quietly clapping. The bailiff shot her a look, and she stopped, but the damage was done. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Who do you think you are?" Marcus reached into his pocket. The movement was deliberate, measured. But before he could pull out his badge, Harrison spoke again. "You people always think you're special. Always think the rules don't apply to you. Well, let me explain something, Mr. Washington. In my courtroom dash. Careful, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on the edge he used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. "You might want to clarify who you mean by you people." More murmurs from the gallery. Harrison's gaze darted to the growing number of people who had stopped to watch through the courtroom's open doors. "I won't be questioned in my own courtroom by some dash," Harrison caught himself, but the unspoken word hung in the air. Marcus felt a familiar heat in his chest, the same heat he'd felt in law school when a professor suggested he might be more comfortable at a different institution. The same heat from when a senior partner had mistaken him for a courier despite his tailored suit. "Somewhat, Your Honor?" Marcus asked quietly. "Please, finish your thought." "For the record." Harrison's jaw clenched. "Bailiff, remove this man from my courtroom." The bailiff took a hesitant step forward, but Marcus held up his hand. "Before you do that," he said to the bailiff, "you might want to consider the liability issues, especially given the recording and the multiple witnesses to Judge Harrison's behavior." The bailiff stopped, looking uncertainly between Marcus and the judge. A young clerk at the front of the courtroom was typing rapidly, documenting everything. "Smart woman," Marcus thought. "Creating a record." "This is your last warning," Harrison said, but his voice had lost some of its authority. The courtroom had shifted, the power dynamic changing with each passing moment. "No, Your Honor," Marcus replied, reaching into his pocket again. "This is yours." The badge case felt smooth in his hand. One quick motion would end this, reveal who he was. But Marcus waited. He wanted Harrison's next words on the record. "I've handled hundreds of cases here," Harrison said, his voice rising. "Many involving people like you. And I've never once had someone show such disrespect. Such complete disregard for authority. If you think you can come into my courtroom and make accusations dash, I haven't made any accusations yet, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted. "I've simply stated facts. Facts supported by audio recordings and witness testimony. Facts that show a clear pattern of racial bias in your sentencing." Harrison slammed his hand on the bench. "How dare you? How dare I what? Your Honor. Point out injustice? Isn't that exactly what this courtroom is supposed to be about?" Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone in the room. The clerk was still typing. The bailiff hadn't moved. Through the open doors, more people had gathered, drawn by the raised voices and tension. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Harrison said, his voice low and threatening. Marcus almost smiled. The irony was almost too perfect. "Actually, Your Honor," he said, finally pulling out his badge case, "I don't think you know who you're dealing with." The leather case felt warm in his hand. One simple motion would change everything. Marcus held Harrison's gaze, seeing the contempt there, the dismissal, the automatic assumptions that had followed Marcus his entire career. He thought about every young black law student who'd faced similar prejudice. Every minority defendant who'd stood before this judge and received a harsher sentence. Every person who'd swallowed their pride and accepted injustice because fighting back seemed impossible. The morning sun had shifted, streaming directly through the high windows now. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. The air conditioning hummed. And in that moment, as Marcus's thumb rested on the edge of his badge case, he knew there was no going back. Some moments change everything. Some fights need to be fought. Some truths need to be spoken. Marcus Washington stood in the suddenly silent courtroom, ready to reveal who he really was, knowing that what happened next would ripple far beyond these walls. "Last chance, Mr. Washington," Harrison's voice cracked through the tense air. "Leave now, or I'll have you arrested for contempt." Marcus's fingers tightened around his badge case. The metal edge pressed into his palm. He looked directly at Harrison, seeing past the robe, past the authority, to the man beneath. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "Would you like to know what bothers me most about this morning?" Harrison's face twisted. "I'm not interested in dash. It's not the fine," Marcus continued. "It's not even the obvious disparity in your sentencing. It's the fact that you never once looked me in the eye when you spoke to me." A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. The clerk's fingers had stopped typing. How dare you continue to dash? You looked at your papers, Marcus said. You looked at the bailiff. You looked at the door. But not once did you look at me. Because that would require seeing me as a person. Harrison's hands gripped the bench. Bailiff, remove this man now. The bailiff took a step forward, but Marcus held his ground. You know what I see when I look at you, Judge Harrison. Marcus's voice remained steady. I see someone who's sat up there so long, has forgotten what justice really means. That's it, Harrison shouted. You're under arrest. The bailiff moved closer, reaching for his handcuffs. Marcus turned slightly toward him. Before you do that, officer, he said quietly, you might want to hear this next part. The bailiff hesitated. Something in Marcus's tone made him pause. Marcus turned back to Harrison. You want to know who I am, Your Honor? Who I really am? I know exactly who you are, Harrison spat. You're just another federal prosecutor Marcus Washington. Marcus cut in, finally flipping open his badge case. The gold shield caught the morning light, sending a reflection dancing across the courtroom walls. United States Department of Justice. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Harrison's face went from red to white in an instant. His mouth opened, but no words came out. And this, Marcus continued, pulling out his Justice Department ID, is my federal credentials. Would you like to examine them, Your Honor? You can finally look me in the eye while you do. The bailiff's hands dropped to his sides. The clerk started typing again, faster than before. I didn't. Harrison stammered. No. Marcus supplied. That's the point, isn't it? You didn't know anything about me. But you thought you knew everything you needed to know the moment I walked into your courtroom. Someone in the gallery whispered, oh damn. Others shushed them, not wanting to miss a word. Mr. Washington, Harrison said, his voice suddenly formal, professional. If I've given any impression of bias, prejudice, discrimination, Marcus took another step forward. You haven't given an impression, Your Honor. You've provided clear evidence. Evidence I'll be detailing in my report to the Judicial Review Board. Harrison's face hardened. Are you threatening me? No, Your Honor. I'm informing you of my professional obligation to report judicial misconduct. The same obligation you've had all these years to provide equal justice under law. Marcus gestured to the words carved above the bench, equal justice under law. How many, Your Honor? He asked. Harrison blinked. How many what? How many people have stood where I'm standing? How many received higher fines, harsher sentences, less courtesy, just because of how they looked? The question echoed in the quiet courtroom. Through the open doors, more courthouse staff had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. You can't possibly suggest. Harrison began. I don't need to suggest anything, Marcus replied. The numbers speak for themselves. The recordings speak for themselves. The pattern is clear. He turned to the clerk. Ms. Thompson, isn't it? The young clerk nodded, her fingers still poised over her keyboard. Please make sure today's transcript reflects everything that's happened here. Every word, every interruption, every fine amount. Yes, sir, she replied, sitting up straighter. Harrison's hands were shaking slightly. Mr. Washington, perhaps we could discuss this in chambers. No, Your Honor. This happened in open court. It will be addressed in open court. Marcus took out his phone, stopped the recording, and emailed it to himself. The soft whoosh of the sent email seemed loud in the quiet room. Here's what's going to happen next, Marcus said, his prosecutor's voice in full effect now. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board. I'm going to request a complete audit of your sentencing records for the past 5 years. And I'm going to personally review every complaint that's ever been filed against you. Harrison's face had gone gray. You have no right, I have every right, Marcus cut in. More importantly, I have a duty. A duty to ensure that every person who walks into this courtroom receives equal treatment under the law. Not just the ones who look like you. A murmur of approval from the gallery. Marcus didn't turn around, keeping his eyes fixed on Harrison. Your Honor, he continued, softer now. Do you know what the worst part is? You don't even see it. You've been doing this so long, you don't even realize when you're doing it anymore. Harrison's shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time, he looked old, tired. What do you want? He asked quietly. Justice, Marcus replied simply. The same thing everyone who walks into this courtroom wants. The same thing that's written on the wall behind you. He gestured to his case file on the defense table. As for my traffic ticket, I'm prepared to present dashcam evidence showing the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. Would you like to review it now, Your Honor? This time looking at the evidence instead of the defendant. The silence stretched. Harrison looked at Marcus, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. Case dismissed, Harrison muttered. No, Marcus said firmly. I want you to look at the evidence. I want you to make a ruling based on facts, not assumptions. That's how this is supposed to work. More whispers from the gallery. The bailiff was standing straighter now, looking at Marcus with something like respect. Harrison picked up the dashcam photos with slightly trembling hands. He studied them, took a deep breath, and looked at Marcus. The evidence clearly shows the light was yellow when you entered the intersection, he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. Case dismissed based on evidence presented. Marcus nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. He gathered his things slowly, deliberately. The badge case went back into his pocket, but its presence had changed everything in the room. As he turned to leave, Marcus paused. I'll be back, Your Honor. Not as a defendant next time, but I will be back. The threat wasn't in his words, but in their promise. In the weight of authority they carried. In the change they demanded. Marcus walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. People moved aside, creating a path. Some nodded to him. Others just stared. At the doorway, he stopped and turned back one last time. Harrison was still watching him, something like fear in his eyes. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the words above the bench. Equal justice under law. Sometimes, Marcus thought, justice needed a witness. Sometimes it needed someone to stand up and say, enough. Today, in this courtroom, that someone had been him. The courtroom erupted into chaos the moment Marcus pulled out his federal prosecutor's badge. The gold shield caught the fluorescent light, sending reflections dancing across the wooden panels. Order! Order in the court! Harrison's gavel slammed down, but his voice lacked its previous authority. His face had drained of color, eyes fixed on the badge in Marcus's hand. As I was saying, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. I'm Federal Prosecutor Marcus Washington, United States Department of Justice. He placed his credentials on the defense table. Would you like to examine them? Harrison's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glasses. That won't be necessary. I insist, Marcus said firmly. After all, you've been very thorough in examining my traffic violation. Surely my credentials deserve the same attention. The bailiff stepped forward, picked up the credentials, and brought them to Harrison. The judge examined them with shaking hands. A young law clerk in the gallery whispered to her colleague, "Is he really a federal prosecutor?" "Look at Harrison's face," her colleague whispered back. "He knows he messed up big time." Marcus stood perfectly still, watching Harrison examine his credentials. The morning sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. "These appear to be in order," Harrison finally said, his voice barely audible. "They are," Marcus replied. "Just like my dashcam evidence, which you refused to examine. Just like my explanation about the yellow light, which you dismissed without consideration." More whispers from the gallery. Someone opened the courtroom door, and a few more courthouse staff peered in, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Washington," Harrison started, then corrected himself. "Prosecutor Washington, I assure you there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" Marcus took a step closer to the bench. "Let's review this misunderstanding, shall we? You fined white defendants an average of $175 for the same violation. Minorities receive fines averaging $425. Then you attempted to fine me $750, nearly double that already inflated amount." Harrison's face flushed. "Those numbers don't what, Your Honor? Don't tell the whole story? Then let's look at the recordings." Marcus held up his phone. "I have audio of every case you've heard this morning. Every interruption, every dismissive comment, every disparity in sentencing." A woman in the back of the courtroom stood up. "He did the same thing to my son last week." "Order!" Harrison's gavel cracked against the wood, but the murmurs continued. Marcus turned to the court clerk. "Ms. Thompson, would you please note in the record that Judge Harrison has verified my credentials as a federal prosecutor?" The clerk nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Now, Marcus continued, turning back to Harrison. Let's discuss what happens next. Harrison's knuckles whitened around his gavel. Prosecutor Washington, perhaps we should continue this discussion in chambers. No, Your Honor. This happened in open court. It will be addressed in open court. Marcus's voice carried to every corner of the room. Your pattern of discriminatory sentencing ends today. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, looking between Marcus and Harrison. Other court officers had gathered near the doors, watching the scene unfold. You have no jurisdiction here, Harrison tried, a last attempt at authority. I have jurisdiction wherever federal civil rights are being violated, Marcus corrected. And I have an obligation to report judicial misconduct when I witness it. Would you like me to cite the relevant statutes? Harrison slumped slightly in his chair. The weight of his black robe seemed to press him down. An older man in the gallery stood up. 2 months ago, he fined my grandson $600 for a broken taillight. White kid before him got a warning for the same thing. More voices joined in. He did it to me too. I knew something wasn't right. Finally, someone saying something. Marcus raised his hand, and the courtroom quieted. The authority in his gesture was natural, earned. Your Honor, he said, his voice level but firm, I'm going to make a call to the district attorney's office. Then I'm going to contact the Judicial Review Board. They'll want to examine your sentencing records. Harrison's face went from red to gray. You can't dash. I can, and I will. Marcus pulled out his phone. Would you like to know why? Because 8 years ago, I stood in a courtroom just like this one, watching another judge hand down disparate sentences based on race. I promised myself that if I ever had the power to stop it, I would. He dialed a number, keeping his eyes on Harrison. This is Federal Prosecutor Marcus Washington, he said into the phone. I need to speak with D.A. Roberts immediately regarding a judicial misconduct case. He paused, listening. Yes, I'll hold. The courtroom remained silent, all eyes fixed on Marcus. Harrison sat motionless, watching as his career began to unravel. D.A. Roberts, Marcus said into the phone. I'm standing in courtroom 3B with Judge William Harrison. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Another pause. Yes, that's correct. I have audio recordings and witness testimony documenting a clear pattern of discriminatory sentencing. He listened for a moment. I understand. We'll expect them within the hour. He ended the call and looked at Harrison. Representatives from the DA's office will be here soon. I suggest you use this time to reflect on your actions. Harrison's face had aged years in minutes. Prosecutor Washington, surely we can dash. No, Your Honor, we can't. Marcus's voice was firm. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves equal treatment under the law. That's not a suggestion. It's not a guideline. It's a constitutional right. He turned to the gallery. If anyone here has experienced similar treatment in Judge Harrison's courtroom, please remain. The DA's office will want to take your statements. At least a dozen people stayed in their seats. Others who had been dismissed earlier began returning, word having spread through the courthouse. Marcus checked his watch. They'll be here in 4 to 5 minutes. In the meantime, he turned back to Harrison. Would you like to review my dashcam evidence now, Your Honor? This time without assumptions about the defendant. Harrison picked up the photos with trembling hands. The courtroom watched as he examined them, his authority diminishing with each passing second. The light was yellow, he admitted quietly. Yes, it was, Marcus agreed. Just like I said. Just like you would have known if you had looked at the evidence instead of making assumptions about me. The morning sun had shifted again, now illuminating the words above the bench, equal justice under law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Marcus gathered his files, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The badge case went back into his pocket, but its impact lingered in the air, in the whispers, in Harrison's defeated posture. Justice, Marcus thought, sometimes needed more than laws. Sometimes it needed someone willing to stand up and say, enough. Someone with the power to make that enough stick. Today, in this courtroom, that someone had been him. And from the looks on the faces in the gallery, it wouldn't end here. The next 4 to 5 minutes in courtroom 3B felt like hours. Marcus sat in the front row, watching Harrison shuffle papers on his bench, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. Your Honor, Marcus called out, checking his phone. The DA's representatives will be here in 10 minutes. Would you like to clear the morning docket? Harrison's hands froze over his papers. Yes, that would be appropriate. He turned to the clerk. Ms. Thompson, please inform the remaining defendants their cases will be rescheduled. The clerk stood up. All remaining cases will be continued to next week. You'll receive notice of your new court date by mail. As people filed out, more came in. Word had spread through the courthouse about what was happening in 3B. The gallery filled with courthouse staff, lawyers, and former defendants. Mr. Washington, a young black woman approached Marcus. I'm Lisa Jackson. Judge Harrison fined me $800 last month for an expired registration. My white neighbor got a $100 fine for the same thing. Marcus pulled out his notebook. Tell me everything. More people lined up behind Lisa. Each had a story. Each had documentation. Marcus wrote everything down, his prosecutor's training kicking in, dates, times, amounts, witnesses. The door opened, and 3 people walked in. Marcus recognized D.A. Roberts immediately. Tall, gray-suited, serious. With him were 2 investigators from the DA's office. Prosecutor Washington, Roberts said, extending his hand. Walk me through what we've got. Marcus handed over his phone with the recordings and his notebook full of witness statements. Pattern of discriminatory sentencing. Clear racial bias. I've got 17 cases just from this morning showing disparity in fines based on race. Roberts flipped through the notebook, his frown deepening. Judge Harrison, he called out, I think you should step down from the bench for now. Harrison stood slowly, his robe seeming to weigh him down. I demand legal representation. You'll need it, Roberts replied. He turned to one of his investigators. Start taking formal statements. Everyone who's experienced discriminatory treatment in this courtroom, form a line outside. We'll interview each of you. The investigator nodded and began organizing the crowd. Marcus watched Harrison descend from the bench. Without his elevated position, he looked smaller, older. Prosecutor Washington, Harrison said quietly as he passed, I hope you understand what you're doing. I have friends in high places. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but firm. So do I, Your Honor. Mine just happened to work for the Justice Department. A man in a suit burst through the doors. Judge Harrison, don't say another word. I'm your attorney, James Miller. A bit late for that, Roberts commented, still reviewing Marcus's notes. Your client's been recording himself violating civil rights all morning. Miller pulled Harrison aside, whispering urgently. Harrison's face grew paler with each word. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from his supervisor at the federal courthouse. Word spreading about what you did. Good job. The office has your back. Roberts approached Marcus. This is bigger than just today, isn't it? 5 years of cases, Marcus replied. Thousands of defendants. Every one of them deserves review. Roberts nodded. It'll take time. Resources. I'll help, Marcus said. This is what I do. More people were filling the courtroom. A local news reporter had somehow slipped in, notebook in hand. Miller approached them. D.A. Roberts. My client is willing to discuss terms. Marcus laughed. This isn't a negotiation. This is a civil rights investigation. The reporter's pen moved faster. Roberts put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Let's hear them out. Even a bad judge deserves due process. Fine, Marcus said. But not here. He gestured to the reporter. This needs to be handled properly. They moved to Roberts' office down the hall. Harrison sat heavily in a chair, his attorney hovering nearby. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus began. But Harrison cut him off. I want to explain, he said, his voice shaking. I never meant. I didn't realize. Save it, Marcus replied. Your records speak for themselves. 5 years of data showing systematic bias in sentencing. That's not accident. That's pattern in practice. Miller leaned forward. My client is willing to step down. Immediate retirement. Not good enough, Marcus said. Every case needs review. Every unfair fine needs to be refunded. And your client needs to publicly acknowledge what he did. Harrison's face reddened. You can't dash. I can. Marcus cut in. And if you fight this, if you try to deny what's on those recordings, I'll make sure every federal prosecutor in the country knows your name. Roberts cleared his throat. Perhaps we could dash. No, Marcus said firmly. No deals. No quiet retirement. The people he hurt deserve justice. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his supervisor. U.S. Attorney wants to talk to you. This might go federal. Marcus showed the text to Roberts, who whistled softly. Judge Harrison, Roberts said, I suggest you consider Prosecutor Washington's terms very carefully. Harrison slumped in his chair. What do you want from me? The truth, Marcus replied. A public statement admitting what you did. Your cooperation in reviewing every case where bias affected your sentencing. And your retirement, effective immediately. Miller whispered something to Harrison, who shook his head. If I do this, Harrison said, what guarantees do I have? None, Marcus replied. Just like the defendants in your courtroom had none. The only difference is, you'll actually get due process. The room fell silent. Down the hall, they could hear the investigators taking statements from Harrison's former defendants. Harrison looked at his hands. I never thought of myself as. I tried to be fair. No, Marcus said, you didn't. You just never thought you'd be caught. Roberts pulled out some papers. I have a preliminary agreement here. We can add details, but the basics are immediate retirement, full cooperation with the investigation, public statement acknowledging bias. Harrison reached for a pen with trembling hands. One more thing, Marcus added. You're going to personally apologize to every person in that courtroom today. Face to face. No hiding behind your bench. Harrison looked up sharply. You can't be serious. Dead serious, Marcus replied. They deserve to see you as you are. No robe. No gavel. Just a man who abused his power. Miller started to object, but Harrison raised a hand. His right, Harrison said quietly. I'll do it. Marcus nodded. Today. Now. Before you lose your nerve. They walked back to the courtroom. The gallery was full now, people standing along the walls. The investigators had finished taking preliminary statements. Harrison stood at the front, looking out at the faces of people he'd wronged. His voice shook as he began to speak. I owe you all an apology. Marcus watched from the back, his phone recording everything. Sometimes, he thought, justice needed more than laws. Sometimes it needed a moment like this. Power laid bare, truth spoken aloud, change happening in real time. The morning sun had shifted again, casting different shadows. But in courtroom 3B, something else had shifted too. Something fundamental. Something that couldn't be undone. Justice, Marcus knew, was just beginning. The courtroom fell silent as Harrison finished his apology. His words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Marcus stepped forward from the back of the room. Thank you, Judge Harrison, he said, his voice carrying clearly. Now, let's make this official. He turned to the court reporter. Ms. Thompson, are you recording? Yes, sir, she replied, fingers poised over her keyboard. Marcus nodded. Judge William Harrison, for the record, please state your admission of systematic bias in your sentencing practices. Harrison's attorney stepped forward. This isn't necessary, it is. Marcus cut him off. Every word needs to be on record. Harrison gripped the podium, his knuckles white. I admit to showing bias in my sentencing practices based on race and ethnicity. Be specific, Marcus pressed. How long has this been happening? At least 5 years, Harrison said, his voice barely audible. Louder, please. For the record. Harrison cleared his throat. For at least 5 years, I have imposed harsher sentences and higher fines on minorities compared to white defendants for the same offenses. A murmur ran through the crowd. D.A. Roberts stood by the door, taking notes. And do you acknowledge that these actions violated the constitutional rights of defendants in your courtroom? Marcus asked. Yes, Harrison replied. I violated their constitutional rights. Marcus turned to the gallery. If anyone needs to add their experience to the record, the DA's office will be setting up a hotline. Every case will be reviewed. Lisa Jackson, the woman with the expired registration case, stood up. What about the fines we already paid? They'll be reviewed and refunded where appropriate, Marcus assured her. He turned back to Harrison. Isn't that right, Your Honor? Harrison nodded wearily. Yes. All fines will be reviewed and refunded where disparities are found. The courthouse staff who had gathered watched in stunned silence. Many had suspected Harrison's bias but had never expected to see him admit it publicly. For the record, Marcus continued, Judge Harrison has agreed to immediate retirement and full cooperation with the investigation. D.A. Roberts, would you like to add anything? Roberts stepped forward. My office will conduct a thorough review of all cases under Judge Harrison's jurisdiction for the past 5 years. We'll be establishing a task force specifically for this purpose. A young lawyer in the gallery raised his hand. What about appeals for closed cases? The admission of systematic bias provides grounds for appeal, Marcus explained. The DA's office will handle those on a case-by-case basis. Harrison's attorney whispered something to him, but Harrison shook his head. I want to say something else, Harrison said suddenly. Marcus gestured for him to continue. I've been on this bench for 20 years, Harrison began. I told myself I was being tough but fair, that I was following the law. He paused, looking around the courtroom. I never thought of myself as racist. But today, seeing those numbers, hearing those recordings, I can't deny it anymore. The room stayed silent, waiting. Prosecutor Washington forced me to see what I've been doing, Harrison continued. The patterns in my sentencing, they are clear, undeniable. I can't justify them. I can't explain them away. I can only acknowledge them and try to make it right. Marcus watched him carefully. And how do you propose to make it right? Beyond the reviews and refunds, Harrison said, I'm willing to testify about systemic bias in the local court system. It's not just me. There are patterns throughout the judiciary that need to be addressed. That caused a stir. Several courthouse staff members shifted uncomfortably. Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from the U.S. attorney, need full briefing. This could lead to broader investigation. Your Honor, Marcus said. Are you saying you're aware of similar practices by other judges? Harrison's attorney tried to interrupt, but Harrison waved him off. Yes, he said firmly. I've seen it. I've been part of it. And I'm willing to provide details. DA Roberts stepped forward quickly. We should continue this discussion in private. Agreed, Marcus said. But first, he turned to the gallery. Everyone who's here to report discriminatory treatment, please stay. The investigators need your statements. Everyone else, please clear the room. As people began moving, Lisa Jackson approached Marcus again. Thank you, she said quietly. Nobody ever believed us before. Marcus nodded. That stops today. The investigators set up at tables, taking detailed statements. Harrison sat with his attorney, writing notes about other judges' practices. DA Roberts was on the phone, presumably with his superiors. Marcus stood in the center of it all, watching justice begin to unfold. His phone buzzed again. The U.S. attorney wanted him in her office in an hour. Ms. Thompson, he called to the court reporter. I'll need a complete transcript of today's proceedings. Already working on it, sir, she replied. Should have it within the hour. Marcus walked over to where Harrison sat writing. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. This isn't personal. This is about justice. Harrison looked up, his face aged beyond his years. I know. That's what makes it worse. You did your job. I failed to do mine. The investigation will be thorough, Marcus warned. Every case, every sentence, every disparity. Good, Harrison replied. It needs to be. Roberts approached them. The chief judge wants to meet. Now. No, Marcus said firmly. First, we secure all the records. Every case file. Every sentencing document. Nothing leaves this courthouse until we've got copies. Roberts nodded. I'll have my team start immediately. Harrison watched the activity around him, his shoulders slumped. 20 years on the bench, he muttered. All it took was one morning to bring it all down. No, Marcus corrected him. It took 5 years of discriminatory sentencing to bring it down. This morning just exposed it. The investigators continued taking statements. The line of people waiting to report their experiences stretched into the hallway. Marcus checked his watch. 40 minutes until his meeting with the U.S. attorney. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. One of the investigators approached with a stack of preliminary statements. Sir, she said, we're seeing patterns. Similar disparities in specific types of cases. It's systematic. Document everything, Marcus replied. Names, dates, amounts. Build the pattern. His phone buzzed yet again. His supervisor, chief judge trying to damage control. Hold your ground. Marcus smiled slightly. The old system was fighting back already. But it was too late. The truth was out. Recorded. Documented. He looked around the courtroom one last time. The morning's traffic court session had turned into something much bigger. Something that could change the entire local justice system. Harrison sat at the defendant's table, still writing his statement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The judge had become the judged. Justice, Marcus thought, sometimes worked in unexpected ways. Sometimes it just needed an opening, a moment, a chance to break through. Today, in this courtroom, it had found that chance. And Marcus Washington had made sure it didn't go to waste. The U.S. Attorney's office occupied the top floor of the federal courthouse. Marcus sat in front of U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen's desk, his evidence spread out before them, recordings, transcripts, witness statements, and Harrison's written confession. "Walk me through it again," Chen said, reviewing the documents. From the beginning, Marcus leaned forward. Simple traffic court appearance. Judge Harrison showed clear bias in sentencing. "I documented everything," confronted him, and he admitted to systematic discrimination going back at least 5 years. And now he's offering information about other judges. "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "He claims there's a pattern throughout the local judiciary." Chen tapped her fingers on the desk. "This could be huge, Marcus. We're talking potential federal investigation into the entire local court system." "I know." Marcus handed her another document. "Here's Harrison's preliminary statement about other judges' practices. Names, dates, specific incidents." She scanned the paper, her frown deepening. "Judge Roberts, Judge Martinez, Judge Thompson. These are senior judges. All with similar patterns of discriminatory sentencing," Marcus added. The door opened, and FBI Special Agent Diana Watson walked in. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic court ran long." She smiled slightly at her own joke. Chen gestured for her to sit. "Agent Watson will be leading the federal investigation. We're going to need everything," Watson said, opening her notebook. "Every recording, every transcript, every witness statement." Marcus nodded. "I've got copies of everything here. The DA's office is gathering more statements as we speak." "How's the media situation?" Chen asked. "Contained, for now," Marcus replied. "But people talk. We've got dozens of witnesses, courthouse staff, lawyers. This won't stay quiet long." Watson made a note. "Maybe it shouldn't. A public investigation might encourage more victims to come forward." "Agreed," Chen said. She turned to Marcus. "You started something big here. Are you ready for what comes next?" Marcus thought about Lisa Jackson and all the others waiting to tell their stories. "Yes. Whatever it takes." "Good." Chen handed him a document. "Because as of now, you're lead prosecutor on this investigation. Agent Watson's team will handle the field work, but you'll be running point on the legal side." Marcus took the paper. "Official assignment to the Judicial Misconduct Task Force. We'll need a secure space to work," Watson said. "Somewhere away from the local courthouse." "Take the 5th floor conference room," Chen replied. "I'll have IT set up secure communications." She looked at Marcus. "How soon can you start?" "I already have." He pulled out his phone. "The DA's investigators have collected 37 statements so far. More coming in every hour." Watson stood up. "Let's get set up. I want to review everything before we start formal interviews." They moved to the 5th floor. The conference room quickly transformed into an investigation headquarters. Evidence boxes arrived from the DA's office. IT specialists set up secure computers and phone lines. Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from Lisa Jackson. "More people want to come forward. What should I tell them?" He called her back immediately. "Ms. Jackson, we're setting up a hotline. I'll send you the number. Anyone who experienced discrimination in Judge Harrison's court, or any other judge's court, should call." "Thank you," she said. "People are finally feeling heard." Watson approached with a stack of files. "We've got records from the past 5 years. The disparities are even worse than Harrison admitted." Marcus reviewed the numbers. White defendants averaged $175 in fines. Black defendants, $425. Hispanic defendants, $475. "Look at the jail sentences," Watson pointed out. Similar pattern. Minorities consistently got longer sentences for the same offenses. Chen walked in. "Just got off the phone with the Justice Department. They're sending a civil rights team." "How soon?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow morning. This is priority now." The day flew by. More witness statements arrived. Patterns emerged. Other judges' names kept appearing. Around 6 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed again. A text from Harrison's attorney, Judge wants to make a full statement. No deals, no conditions. Marcus showed the message to Chen and Watson. Could be trying to save himself, Watson said skeptically. Or he could be ready to blow this whole thing open, Marcus countered. Chen nodded. Set it up. But everything on record, everything documented. Marcus texted back. Tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Federal Courthouse. Full record. The reply came quickly. He'll be there. Watson started packing up files. We should call it a day. Fresh start tomorrow. One more thing, Marcus said. He pulled up the court's electronic records. Look at these sentencing patterns by zip code. They gathered around his computer. The data was clear. Defendants from predominantly minority neighborhoods received consistently harsher sentences. Systemic discrimination, Chen said quietly. Built right into their practices. Marcus sat back. This is bigger than Harrison. Bigger than individual bias. This is about a whole system that's failed its people. Then we fix it, Watson said firmly. Case by case if we have to. Chen squeezed Marcus's shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. As they left the federal courthouse, Marcus saw news vans already gathering. Word was spreading. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from his supervisor. You did good today, Marcus. This needed to happen. He looked back at the courthouse, thinking about all the people who'd faced injustice within its walls. About Lisa Jackson and others like her. About Harrison's confession and the changes it might bring. Sometimes justice needed more than one moment, more than one person standing up. Sometimes it needed to tear down old systems to build better ones. Tomorrow, they would start that process. One case at a time, one story at a time, one truth at a time. Marcus smiled slightly as he walked to his car. The morning sun would rise on a different kind of justice system tomorrow, and he would be there to help build it. The Judicial Review Board convened at 9 a.m. sharp in the federal courthouse's main conference room. 7 members sat behind a long oak table, facing Harrison and his attorney. Marcus stood at the podium, evidence boxes stacked beside him. Let the record show this is an emergency session of the Judicial Review Board, the chairman announced. Present are board members, Judge William Harrison, his counsel, and federal prosecutor Marcus Washington. Harrison looked smaller in his business suit, without his judicial robe. Dark circles under his eyes suggested a sleepless night. Judge Harrison, the chairman continued, you've requested this hearing to make a full statement regarding discriminatory practices in the local court system. Is that correct? Yes, Harrison replied, his voice rough. I have a prepared statement, and I'm ready to answer any questions. Marcus placed a recorder on the podium. With the board's permission, I'd like to record these proceedings. The chairman nodded. Proceed. Harrison stood, hand shaking slightly as he held his papers. For 20 years, I've served as a judge in this district. Today, I'm here to admit that I failed in my most basic duty, providing equal justice under law. The room fell silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers stopped. Yesterday, Prosecutor Washington exposed my biased sentencing practices. But it goes deeper than that. The entire local court system operates with ingrained prejudices that we've normalized over years. Board members exchanged glances. One started taking rapid notes. I have documentation, Harrison continued, pulling out a thick folder. Dates, cases, specific instances where I and other judges imposed harsher sentences based on race. Marcus watched the board members' reactions. Shock, disbelief, and on some faces, a flicker of recognition. Judge Harrison, the chairman interrupted. These are serious allegations. They are not allegations, Harrison replied firmly. They are admissions, and I can prove every word. For the next 2 hours, Harrison detailed specific cases. Names, dates, disparities in sentencing. Patterns emerged. Higher fines for minorities, longer sentences, fewer plea deals offered. Marcus's phone buzzed quietly. A text from Agent Watson. News vans outside. Stories breaking. The chairman called a brief recess. Marcus stepped into the hallway where Watson waited. How's it going in there? She asked. Harrison's giving them everything, Marcus replied. 20 years of institutional bias laid bare. Media's running with the story, Watson said, showing him her phone. Local news headlines screamed. Judge admits racial bias and federal investigation into local courts. They returned as Harrison continued his testimony. He named names, described private conversations in judges' chambers, revealed unwritten rules about handling cases from certain neighborhoods. In my court yesterday, Harrison said, Prosecutor Washington showed me what I'd become. What we'd all become. A system so comfortable with discrimination that we stopped seeing it. The chairman leaned forward. What are you proposing? Complete review of all cases. New sentencing guidelines. Mandatory bias training. External oversight. Harrison looked at Marcus. Whatever it takes to ensure this never happens again. Marcus stepped to the podium. The U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to assist with implementation of these reforms. This will take months, one board member protested. Years maybe. Then it takes years, Marcus replied firmly. Justice is worth the time. The chairman called another recess. Board members huddled in corners, whispering urgently. Harrison sat alone, his attorney making calls. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Lisa Jackson. People are watching the news. More coming forward. We need help managing the calls. He texted back. Send them to the federal hotline. Every story matters. The board reconvened. The chairman looked grim. Based on Judge Harrison's testimony and the evidence presented, this board has no choice but to take immediate action. He read from a prepared statement. All local judges will undergo immediate review. The U.S. Attorney's Office will oversee implementation of new guidelines. And we formally request a Department of Justice investigation into systemic discrimination in our courts. Harrison's shoulders slumped in relief. His attorney patted his back. Additionally, the chairman continued, we're establishing a victim compensation fund. Anyone who experienced discriminatory sentencing can file for review and restitution. Marcus gathered his files. The federal task force is ready to begin work immediately. One more thing, Harrison said suddenly. He turned to face the gallery, now filled with press and public. I owe an apology to every person who stood before me in court. Every person I judged not by their actions, but by their race. I'm sorry, and I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make it right. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Outside the conference room, Watson waited with Chen. It's done, Marcus told them. The board authorized everything we asked for. Just the beginning, Chen replied. Now the real work starts. They walked to their makeshift command center. The hotline phones rang constantly. Investigators sorted through case files. IT specialists set up databases to track patterns. Look at this, Watson called out. She pointed to a map on her screen. Sentencing disparities by neighborhood. Clear as day. Marcus studied the data. Send it to the DOJ team. They'll want everything we've got. His phone buzzed. A message from the young clerk, Ms. Thompson. Other court reporters coming forward. We've been documenting these patterns for years. Telling anyone who would listen. Now someone's listening, he texted back. The day blurred into evening. More witnesses. More statements. More evidence of systemic failures. Around 8 p.m., Chen found Marcus still reviewing files. Go home, she ordered. We've got a long road ahead. Marcus gathered his things, thinking about how much had changed in 24 hours. One traffic court appearance had sparked a revolution in justice. As he left the building, he saw Lisa Jackson talking to reporters. For years, we knew something was wrong, she was saying. Now, finally, someone believed us. Finally, something's changing. Marcus walked to his car, remembering Harrison's words. Whatever it takes to ensure this never happens again. The system wouldn't change overnight, but it would change. One case at a time, one reform at a time, one truth at a time. Sometimes justice needed more than one moment of revelation. Sometimes it needed sustained effort, committed people, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. Tomorrow would bring more work, more witnesses, more changes to implement. But tonight, Marcus thought, they'd taken the first step toward real justice. And there was no going back. 6 months after that morning in traffic court, Marcus Washington stood in courtroom 3B again. The room had changed. New signs posted clearly visible sentencing guidelines. A public defender's desk prominently placed. Information about the Victim Compensation Fund displayed in multiple languages. All rise, the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Maria Rodriguez presiding. The new judge entered, her robe crisp, her expression alert and engaged. She'd been appointed after a rigorous vetting process that Marcus himself had helped design. Good morning, She addressed the courtroom. Before we begin today's cases, I want to remind everyone of their rights. If you need a translator, raise your hand now. If you need a public defender, let us know. This court serves justice equally to all. Marcus smiled slightly. The words weren't just ceremony anymore. They were backed by action, oversight, and consequences. His phone buzzed. A text from Lisa Jackson. Turn on the news when you can. He stepped into the hallway and checked his phone's news feed. The headline made him pause. Former Judge Harrison testifies before Congress on judicial reform. The video showed Harrison in Washington, D.C., speaking to a congressional committee on judiciary reform. What I did was wrong. Harrison's voice came through clearly. What we all did was wrong. But thanks to one prosecutor's courage to stand up, we're changing. My testimony today is part of that change. Marcus put his phone away as Agent Watson approached. Quite a different scene from 6 months ago, she said, looking around the courthouse. Numbers don't lie, Marcus replied. Sentencing disparities down 89% since the reforms, over 2,000 cases reviewed. $4.3 million in restitution paid out. And that's just the beginning, Watson added. DOJ is using our model for investigations in 3 other states. They walked to what had become their permanent office in the federal building. The wall displayed their progress, charts showing declining sentencing disparities, maps of reviewed cases, lists of implemented reforms. Chen met them at the door. Just got off the phone with Justice. They're expanding the task force. Want to know if you'll head up the national training program. Marcus considered it. Teaching other prosecutors how to spot and stop discriminatory sentencing. Exactly, Chen confirmed. Your traffic court moment is becoming a template for systemic change. His phone buzzed again. A message from Ms. Thompson, the court clerk. You should see the new judges in action. Night and day difference. The hotline phone still rang, but less frequently now. Most calls were from other jurisdictions wanting to implement similar reforms. Remember that first day? Watson asked, looking at their wall of data. When Harrison made his confession, Marcus nodded. Feels like years ago. Because we've done years of work in 6 months, Chen said. Speaking of which, she handed him a report. The official 6-month review of the judicial reform program. Marcus flipped it open, reading key statistics. 2,147 cases reviewed, 1,892 sentencing adjustments, $4.3 million in restitution, 42 judges underwent mandatory bias training, 15 new procedures implemented, 8 judges retired or resigned, 6 new judges appointed under new guidelines, 3 states adopting similar reforms. It's working, Marcus said quietly. Because you made it work, Chen replied. You took one moment of injustice and turned it into systemic change. His phone buzzed. A text from Harrison. Finished testifying. Committee seems receptive. Thank you for showing me the truth that day. Marcus remembered Harrison's face in traffic court. The moment everything changed. The judge had become an unlikely ally in reform, his testimony helping to change systems far beyond their jurisdiction. Watson pointed to a new set of files on her desk. 3 more jurisdictions requesting investigation. They've got judges like Harrison was. Need prosecutors like you to expose it. Then let's help them, Marcus replied. Send me the files. Chen smiled. There's something else you should see first. She led them to courtroom 3B's observation gallery. Judge Rodriguez was hearing traffic cases. A young black man stood before her, explaining his situation. Your Honor, the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. Do you have evidence to support that? Rodriguez asked, her tone professional and neutral. Yes, Your Honor. Dashcam footage. Let's review it then, Rodriguez said, gesturing to the court's new video system. Marcus watched the scene unfold. Equal justice under law. Not just words carved in stone anymore, but actions played out in real time. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from his supervisor. You started something here, Marcus. Something important. He thought about that morning 6 months ago. One traffic ticket. One moment of standing up. One choice to say, enough. The young man's case was dismissed based on the dashcam evidence. He walked out with his head high, treated with dignity and respect, ready to tackle those new jurisdictions. Watson asked. Marcus nodded. Justice doesn't stop here. They walked back to their office, passing the wall of achievements. Each number represented a person. Each statistic a story of justice served or denied. Chen handed him travel documents. First training session next week. Prosecutors from 12 states coming to learn. Tell them to bring their traffic court stories, Marcus said with a slight smile. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest courts. He looked out the window at the courthouse steps where it all began. The morning sun hit them just like that day 6 months ago. But everything else had changed. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't just a moment. It wasn't just one person standing up or one judge admitting wrong. It was the daily work of reform. The constant push for change. The endless effort to make the system better. His phone buzzed with another message. Another jurisdiction asking for help. Another chance to make a difference. Marcus Washington, federal prosecutor, picked up the files and got back to work. Because justice wasn't just served once. It had to be served every day, in every court, for every person. And he would make sure of it, one case at a time.